Okay, Adam, you go.
Thank you, Maura. Good afternoon, and welcome to our conversation today. My name is Adam Levine, and I'm the Executive Director here at the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, or NYMTC. If you've gone to the effort of logging in and joining us, you have an interest in the topic of alternative energy sources in the transportation realm. We are eager to hear your thoughts, opinions, and experiences on this topic that is growing in importance in so many of our discussions about transportation. Today's session is the latest in a series of outreach efforts that are part of Moving Forward 2055, our regional transportation plan that is charting the course for transportation decisions in the NYMTC region over the next 30 years. These outreach efforts have included pop-up events across New York City, Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley, as well as a website survey that has provided thousands of comments. Our series of focus groups has also contributed valuable feedback for the development of Moving Forward 2055. And now we are focusing on individual topics in our series of forums, including recent discussions on freight, active transportation, human services transportation, and safety and micromobility. I'd like to introduce Stephanie Brooks, who will guide us through our format today. Stephanie?
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. So just so you know, we will be doing some interactive polling today, sort of to get your feedback on the things that are getting presented for you today. Just a few ground rules before we get started. Participants will remain on mute. We will be using the platform called Poll Everywhere, which is an online polling platform. You'll open your browser or whatever format you're using, and you can respond to polls and see them in real time on the screen. The chat window will also be available for comments as well as our polling. So if anything comes up or there's something you forgot to say in your poll, or you have any additional comments, feel free to use our chat function here on WebEx. We are recording this workshop, which I think you heard at the beginning. And if you are an AICP to the American Planning Association, we are offering 1.5 credits today for this presentation. So the chat window, I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with WebEx, but you'll see the chat is that little bubble, the chat bubble, if you want to open it up at the bottom of your screen, and you'll be able to type in your comments in the chat window. And our agenda for today. So we are, there'll be a little introduction about NYMTC, a brief little intro about using Poll Everywhere, and we'll test the system so that you can work it on your browser and make sure it's working for you. We can do any troubleshooting we need to do. That'll be very brief. And then we will be discussing alternative energy options in the NYMTC region, and our subject matter experts will be guiding you through some information. And then we will begin polling again throughout that part of the presentation to get your feedback on some of the content we have been presenting. And then an AICP, we'll have information at the end about how to log your AICP credits, continuing education credits. So intro, I'm going to present Jerry Bogas, who's going to talk us through a little bit about NYMTC. Go for it, Jerry.
Hi, folks. Good afternoon, everybody. So this is mainly an interactive session, but we do want to give you a little bit of context so you understand our organization and the role we play in the federal planning process. So NYMTC, the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, is a metropolitan planning organization which covers New York City, Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley. You can see some of the main points of our mission. We serve as a collaborative forum. We produce sound technical analysis. We help our members develop a shared regional vision. And of course, we try to capture the maximum amount of federal funds available for transportation improvements in our region. Next slide, Stephanie. So the important thing to understand about NYMTC is that the organization is a regional council. We have 9 voting members and 7 advisory members. There are over 400 organizations like this in the country, and they are formed in response to requirements at the federal level that regions basically collaborate on how best to use federal dollars. This slide shows on the upper left, we have our 5 suburban county executives from Westchester, Rockland, and Putnam counties, and the Hudson Valley and Suffolk and Nassau counties on Long Island. And then on the upper right, we have 2 New York City members, the director of New York City Department of City Planning and the City Transportation Commissioner. There's also the State Transportation Commissioner and the Chief Executive Officer of the MTA. Those are our voting members. And you can see we have several advisory members under that, including New Jersey Transit, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and our sister MPO across the river, the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, as well as the State Department of Environmental Conservation and 3 federal oversight agencies. Next slide. And this is the region that we cover: 5 boroughs of New York City, 5 suburban counties, 10 counties in total at the core of a larger metropolitan region. Next slide. So the regional transportation plan is really a foundational piece to the overall planning process that we're required to maintain. It's updated every 4 years. So we are currently updating, as Adam indicated, the plan to be moving forward 2055, which will be adopted in 2025. Our current plan is moving forward. That is the plan of record that is online right now. These plans have a minimum 20-year planning horizon. We usually do more than that. As Adam indicated, this next plan will be a 30-year planning horizon. They contain both long-range and short-range strategies and actions. So this isn't just looking at the horizon year, but rather throughout the period, the 30-year period of the plan. And all projects and strategies that are included are considered for a financial plan that it's required to be part of the plan to show whether or not we think we can afford what we're planning into the future. Next slide. Our members have provided 6 vision goals around which the plan is being organized. You can see them here. Their goal statements are obviously more extensive than this, but they fall within these buckets: safety and security, infrastructure, resiliency, congestion, land use, and transportation equity. Those are the proposed goals for the next plan. Next slide. So now Stephanie will take you through using Poll Everywhere, and then we'll get into the interactive section of our event. Thank you all for your time.
Yep, thanks again. So if you could open up your browser, whether you're using your tablet or your laptop or even your phone, any browser you use, whether it's Safari, Firefox, or Chrome or Edge or anything like that, any browser will work. And you'll just go to pollev.com/NYMTC. I'll put it in the chat as well. Sometimes when you click the chat in WebEx, it'll send you to are you sure you want to go to this to leave this site, and you can click yes, or just type it into your browser directly if you are having trouble accessing it via WebEx. What we will do is it should show up on your screen. You'll see you'll enter any sort of name, or you can just remain anonymous and just be a number. And you'll see a map should be showing up fairly soon, and you'll just respond to questions and prompts through the presentation. So right now, we already have somebody in Rockland. Great. So you'll see this is our first poll, so you can sort of see how the poll works. We have a place where you can sort of put in generally where you're located, so we get a good sense of people in the NYMTC region and where people are calling in from. We're seeing some good feedback already. We've got some folks in Manhattan. We've got some folks in some outside the region. Great. Number of people in Manhattan, the lower and upper, and other folks outside the region. Great. We'll give this another 30 seconds or so, just so people can get familiar with the platform. Right. Give it another 10 seconds, and then we'll go to the next slide. All right, and then your organization. Are you representing an organization today? We see already someone put in federal, consultant team, a community advocacy group. Great. I see some from CTAA. That's fantastic. Welcome. We'll give this another 20 seconds or so, so people can put in all of their feedback. Give it another 10 seconds. So we'd like to get it's great to get a diverse representation of area within the NYMTC region, and also types of organizations and people. So this is wonderful. All right, so we'll go to the next question. And this is an open-ended question where you can just type in to your browser your top of mind concerns do you have on the topic of this session. So your thoughts about alternative energy, anything that you really want to be sure we discuss or things that have been on your mind. I'll give it these take us sometimes a little while to show up. So I'm going to give this about 30 seconds for people to type in some feedback. Any concerns you have, anything out of interest, anything that's burning thoughts and issues you might have. Just type them into the poll. And again, you can always put things into the chat as well if you would like. Pollutants and ideas we're seeing incentives. Great, thank you. Safety, that is a key concern. We will be talking about a lot of these things. We will be talking about incentives as well later today. How do we fast track green electricity to provide enough? Fleet transitions for smaller agencies. This is exactly the feedback we're looking for. Thank you. To give it another 20 seconds just so that they can show up on the screen. People can see the kind of feedback we're receiving today. All right, another 5 seconds and we'll move on. We've gotten a good amount of feedback. Oh, alternatives besides just electric vehicles. Great. Grid resiliency. Excellent. Okay, thank you. And just so you know, all of this information lives on the back end of Poll Everywhere. So all of this information is recorded. So you will, you know, all your feedback will be recorded and it will go towards informing the plan 2055. Okay, I'm going to go forward now to the next slide. What type of community do you reside in? Is it urban, suburban, even exurban and rural? We have some fairly rural counties, like up in Putnam, parts of Putnam, definitely parts of Long Island. So just let us know. Suburban. Much appreciate the feedback. All right, I'll give it another 20 seconds. This is great, just to get a sense of where people are coming from. Great. And I will move on to the main meat of our presentation. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Rich Dembo, from Cambridge Systematics, who will be walking us through some alternative energy options in the NYMTC region, and then we'll go into some more polls. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Stephanie, and welcome everyone to our forum on alternative energy. I want to start out a little bit about why we're here today to talk about alternative energy in the context of NYMTC's next regional transportation plan and what this means for the next 25 plus years of the planning horizon. Over here on the right side of this slide, you can see the graph that shows energy consumption in the U.S. going back, almost to the beginning of the country's origin, and the rapid rise, especially over the last 75 years or so, as we've grown, as the country and economy has grown. And I don't think this is a surprise to anybody on this forum, but it does show that this is a key concern, this rapid rise in use of fossil fuels and conventional fuels. So why are we talking about this in the context of NYMTC's plan? First and foremost, it directly relates to visions and goals that Jerry talked about at the beginning of this forum. There are two in particular, two goals. There are elements of the vision. One is addressing resiliency, one's addressing infrastructure. And the first is that we invest in resilient energy infrastructure to minimize the impacts of stressors and of disruptions on the transportation system and those who use the system. Another is that we want to maintain and improve the infrastructure in a sustainable and environmentally just manner. So going into development of this plan, those are two of the goals that we're thinking about. And this topic clearly falls under those two goal categories. We also have several federal and state plans and policies that address this topic. I'll touch on some of those quickly in a few slides. But the important part here is that many of those programs provide transportation funding And that's funding that can help us meet these related goals and achieve the vision that NYMTC is aiming for. And then NYMTC as an organization also has a key role in mitigating some of the climate impacts through use of these fossil fuels, and a role in supporting cleaner transportation energy sources. So this is directly important to the work that NYMTC does, particularly through this plan and some of the other programs that outflow from the plan. So while NYMTC isn't an energy producer and doesn't distribute energy or regulate, there are ways that NYMTC could address this in moving forward 2055 and through the planning that comes out of that. And examples of those are getting your feedback, which we're doing today, that can shape some of the ways that NYMTC proposes to invest available transportation funds through the transportation plan, how to shape planning studies that would be considered in NYMTC's work program over the following years to address some of these topics. And NYMTC also plays other roles related to this topic, such as the data they provide to municipalities or coordinate among municipalities for developing plans and programs, technical assistance that they provide, and information sharing and supporting a partnership. So that's a quick overview of why alternative energy is important for our discussion today. Next slide, please. So what do we mean when we're talking about alternative energy sources? What we mean really are the fuels that are derived from non-petroleum sources, either partially or entirely. And these include electricity, compressed natural gas, liquefied natural gas, hydrogen, propane, methanol, and biofuels such as biodiesel. The vehicles that use these, the alternative fuel vehicles, operate on these alternative fuels, either wholly on those fuels or in some combination of some of these fuels and conventional fuels such as gas and diesel. And then the main environmental benefit, of course, from these alternative fuels is that they generate much lower air pollution or climate change impacts, which can impact both the natural environment and public health. So next slide, please. And we have a poll question to start things off. We're asking here, what's your overall feeling towards alternative energy's future in transportation? And we're looking for your open-ended responses here, your thoughts on this particular question. So we'll give that a little bit of time up on the screen while we collect some responses. Let's see, necessary and overdue is one of the comments. We'll give it a few more seconds before we move on. Optimistic, but worried that incentives aren't strong enough. Yep. We hear that frequently. Requires education and outreach. These are great responses. It's good to get a sense of the group's feelings overall. So, all right, I'll go ahead and Stephanie, we can move on to the next slide. And there are plenty of opportunities, future slides with more polling questions. So here we show some of the energy trends in New York State in particular, kind of a high level. The graphs show the energy generation in the state by source. And you can see in that first graph that over the last 10 to 12 years, the energy generated in New York from coal and nuclear has dropped, while renewables and natural gas have increased quite a bit. Breaking that down a little further in the graph on the right is the generation source for renewables. And you can see from these that this graph that hydropower makes up a really large portion of the renewable resource energy generation in New York State. So what's interesting, that's high level energy generation as a whole. What's interesting, I think, for us to consider where we come from in New York is that the state overall consumes less total energy per capita than residents in every other state except for Rhode Island. So that's a pretty good, interesting statistic there. The per capita energy consumption in New York State in the transportation sector is lower than that in any other state, and that the per capita energy related carbon dioxide emissions are consistently lower than other states. So these are things working in New York State's favor when we consider this topic and how it might be used in the plan and strategies that flow out of the plan. So next slide, please. So honing in a little bit more on transportation specifically, and these bullets are national statistics. The transportation sector is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and greenhouse gas emissions, of course, are a big driver of climate change and climate impacts. Transportation accounts for 28% of those emissions, and this is a huge concern for how we address climate change, it being the major source. And overall, we focus a lot of resources on addressing these impacts, some of which I'll get into in a few slides. But increasing the use of alternative energy fuels is one way to mitigate some of these emission impacts, also improve local air quality. And we have, as I mentioned before, many programs, state and local level underway in New York that will do so, which I'll cover in a few slides. These programs address vehicle purchases, charging and fueling infrastructure, incentives in other program areas. And just quickly before I leave this slide, that chart on the right shows the number of electric vehicle registrations in the region. And of course, electric vehicles are just one example of the use of alternative energy. So we'll go to the next slide. We have another poll question for you. And the question is, do you currently own any of these following vehicles? And if you do, please select all that apply. We have battery electric vehicles or trucks, hybrid electric vehicles or trucks. Other alternatives are non-electric, and then a battery assist electric bicycle. And I see some answers are starting to come in now. Looks like we have hybrid electric vehicles or trucks. Oh, here we go. We other alternatives are non-electric vehicles or trucks. A little bit of that. Don't see anybody responding for battery electric assist bicycles or battery electric vehicles or trucks. That's okay. Stephanie, I'll defer to you about keeping this up for a little longer or moving ahead. All right, so if you did answer yes to any of those categories, we're interested in knowing what some of the reasons are for your purchase. And this is open-ended. You can respond with any kind of reasons that you decided to make that purchase. Still don't see any responses coming in yet.
This one may take a little time. Sometimes the open-ended do, so we'll just give it a little bit longer, see if people to put in the reasons why they purchased a non or hybrid vehicle. Wow, there was a forced to sell an e-assisted bike. So fear of battery fires. Yeah, we will be discussing that.
Yeah. And we can keep that in mind. The next question is going to ask if your answer was no, or you didn't have a response to any of the vehicles, what are some of your reasons why? maybe we can go ahead and move to the to that question. So yeah, so the question is, if not, if you didn't answer that you have one of those alternative fuel vehicles, what would encourage you to consider one? From the previous response, I think safety concerns were noted. So that's a potential answer. So are there any factors that that would encourage you to consider an alternative fuel vehicle versus conventional fuel? So I see incentives would be helpful, price equity with internal combustion engine vehicle. Those are certainly good considerations. Higher gasoline taxes. Leave this one open for a little bit longer because some of these are important for us to get feedback on. Long-term cost efficiency. All right, I'll give it another 10 seconds or so. More superchargers for electric vehicles. Yep, we certainly hear a lot of these considerations when people are weighing the decision whether or not to consider a vehicle. If we got a discount for the CBD tolling fee, that would be a good one. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. So I mentioned in the beginning of the forum that there is a lot of funding, a lot of legislation, a lot of funding that's provided by the federal government to states and to regions to address the issue. Many of these are driven by national energy and environmental goals, such as those in the federal transportation legislation and environmental legislation. So at the federal level, we have a lot of legislation and funding from agencies like the Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, Housing and Urban Development, and others. And the programs that are funded by these funds come from or focus on renewable energy, energy transmission, battery research, building efficiency, vehicle efficiency, clean fuels, public transportation, and a lot more. So why we're considering it here is that a lot of the funding that flows to states, some of that also goes down to the regions, and the regions decide how to spend these funds. And that's actually one of the key roles for NYMTC. And as I mentioned before, one of the reasons we're talking about that this topic here in this forum. So NYMTC works with stakeholders to decide how some of these funding sources should be spent and invested. So that's a good motivator and one of the reasons we're looking for feedback through forums such as this. Next slide, please. So combined with those state requirements, state policies and legislation and funding sources, we have statewide policy and planning. And just a couple of the things underway that I list here from New York are the New York State Energy Plan, which has several goals and requirements and policies. Some of the highlights are 70% renewable electricity by 2030, 100% zero emission electricity by 2040, specific reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from earlier levels by 2030, and then again by 2050, and a net zero emissions statewide by 2050. So that's overall energy approach to energy for New York State in this New York State Energy Plan. And then more specifically for transportation, which we're talking about today, is the transportation energy policy. And that's 100% of all car and truck and bus sales be zero emission vehicles by 2045. That's a specific component of that plan there. There's also the adoption of additional requirements for clean fuel or clean vehicle fleets and investments in alternative fuel infrastructure and removing some of the barriers that currently exist for that infrastructure. So That's just one example of some of the statewide activities, but a lot of these are driving what the member agencies of NYMTC and NYMTC itself are working on, and some of the funding that's available. Next slide, please. So for here, you can see this is from the New York State Energy Plan. The main point of this slide is just to show that it does have some key milestones and deadlines for activities. And it's got this framework. There's a scoping plan, which is a framework for how the state's going to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions and achieve the net zero emissions. And also ways to ensure that there are equitable benefits among all the communities that are impacted during this transition. So the scoping plan with these milestones is like a living document for implementing the energy plan, and has methods for reporting on the progress, updating the plan itself, and then the scoping plan itself. So this is a key driver in a lot of what we're talking about today. And a lot of activity and resources are focused on following the scoping plan in these steps. Next slide, please. And then moving down to the local level, there's a whole lot of activity underway from the local member jurisdictions that make up the NYMTC region, the local governments. This slide presents only a few examples of programs that align with the other activities we're talking about. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but there's a lot underway with the New York City Clean Fleet Planning effort, which is transitioning many city cars and trucks to electric and other fuels. It's got specific goals for 2035 and beyond. And one of the key parts of this plan is that under activities already underway, the city's already operating one of the largest network of charging and refueling stations in the state. And we have thousands of vehicles that are running on cleaner alternative fuels than we had just a few years ago. Likewise, MTA has committed to reduce emissions from some of the operations at their facilities and from their vehicles. They have specific targets by certain milestones as well. We have a lot of clean cities coalitions, and there are two big ones in this region that are pretty formal organizations that work with communities to promote alternative fuels and vehicle technologies. A lot of the funding and support for clean cities comes from the U.S. Department of Energy. A little closer to home, NYMTC's engaged with a lot of the neighboring MPOs as part of their Metropolitan Area Planning Forum to look at and undertake some clean freight corridors planning. And here, this is where they're focusing on opportunities for designating and developing clean freight corridors, which are used to move a lot of goods by truck, and ensure that there are adequate ways to have infrastructure that support the use of clean fuels along these corridors. So these actions and a lot of others are already reducing by thousands the number of gallons of gasoline and diesel fuels that we use. And we'll continue to do so. So a lot of what the plan aims to do is incorporate and align with and capitalize on these efforts. So let's go to the next slide where we have another poll question. Here we list a few projects and initiatives that are underway by category, by type, and we're asking you to indicate up to 5 of these that are most important to you. And they cover things like fueling stations, converting public vehicles, school buses, or private vehicles to cleaner vehicles, and incentive programs. So I'll leave this up for a few minutes because there are a lot of options, and ask you to choose up to 5 that are important to you.
And for those of you who put other, I noticed an other here, if you could just put in the chat what your other what else is important to you. We'd love to hear that. So you could just pop it into the chat function and just send it to everyone. Just let us know what that other idea is.
See a lot of the blue lines filling up. This is good.
And I'll be continuing to check the chat. If there's anything else you'd like to add for that other choice that you put in, please just let us know what your thought. Okay, so here we go. Other includes blue highways, not just rail for freight. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for giving us your thoughts about what that other option is or other project initiative that is important. Another response, driving charges for electric vehicles through renewable energy. Great, thank you. Deriving charging for electric vehicles through renewable energy. Thanks very much.
I'm seeing a pretty even mix among the types of projects that are important to the participants. Nothing really stands out as not having received any responses. Although I do see incentives for the purchase of private vehicles that use cleaner fuels, has a lower percentage of responses, as does incentives for moving more commodities by rail rather than trucks. But generally, across the board, there are support expressed for each of these options. Stephanie, is there anything else in the chat that's showing up?
No, just those two, blue highways and deriving charging from renewable energy for electric vehicles. So thank you all for putting that in so we know what other thoughts you have. And I think we'll move on to the next slide.
Yep. So here we show a couple maps that highlight some of the existing infrastructure for fueling and charging. The map on the left shows designated alternative fuel corridors, and these are the priority routes for installation of some of the infrastructure needed to support cleaner vehicles. And the idea here is to look along heavily traveled corridors and establish priority installation areas to support movement of clean fuel vehicles or alternative fuel vehicles along these corridors. So there's a lot of activity underway, and this is the NYMTC region plus expanding out a little bit, because a lot of these will be for travelers and others who might be worried about the ability to recharge or refuel alternative fueled vehicles. Over on the right side, we have a map of existing electric charging stations that are public stations within the region. These represent a variety of different location types, including parking garages, public parking garages. Some are parks, some are shopping centers, government buildings, and others. So you can see that if you can see the legend, you may not be able to. These are primarily electric charging locations. There are a very small number of LNG or ethanol or other types there, but primarily these are electric stations. So that shows it. The map, I think, the map might imply that there's a lot more charging than what's currently out there. When you zoom in, there's a lot more space in between these stations, but you can see that there is some coverage across the NYMTC region, and then as you move outward from the region, when it comes to electric charging stations. So we'll go to the next slide and have some more poll questions. And here we're trying to get your thoughts and feedback on locations for expanding some of the charging and fueling infrastructure. So we have several location types listed here. We're asking you to choose up to 5 options on where you would choose to expand the charging and fueling infrastructure that's in place now. I'm seeing some responses come in. Got curbsides, residential complexes, offices, private parking facilities, freight distribution centers or truck rest stop areas. I'll leave this up for a little longer because this is looking for some good feedback and input here. And you may have some thoughts on particular thoughts in some of these locations. Towards the end, we have the opportunity to provide open-ended answers on any particular concerns you have on this topic. So if you do have some, make a note of those now and you can add those to the conversation later. So I'm seeing the top choices so far, top 3 at least, is curbside, residential complexes, and office complexes or employment centers. Those are getting the most, but it's pretty even distribution here. Civic institutions like libraries and government buildings are getting some responses, and freight distribution centers. All right, Stephanie, let's move on to the next question, please. And in this one, we're asking, how would you rate the availability of charging infrastructure in your community? So by this, we mean where you live from among these choices here. Or if you don't know of any nearby charging infrastructure, you can indicate that as well.
Just adding, Rich, to the chat, we have regarding charging locations. Locations for charging fueling infrastructure cover all the location options listed. In New York City, we prioritized educational and I think medical as well as on street. So just wanted to add that chat comment. Thank you very much.
So the responses we've received so far, 50% would rate the availability good, and the other 50% are do not know of any nearby charging infrastructure. Oh, now we've got a little more in here. One rating of fair. All right. Stephanie, I think we can move on to the next question, please. And this one's a little bit broader. Do you feel sufficiently informed about the types of alternative energy solutions and their pros and cons? So far, we have 60% who responded saying yes and 40% saying no. All right. I think we can go ahead and move to the next slide, Stephanie. So for those who answered no, we'd like to know why not. Are there any, what are the factors for your no answer to are you sufficiently informed? We have overly politicized. try to stay informed, but rapidly advancing data. Yeah, that is true. There are a lot of changes in this field. These are good answers. Thank you for these. Leave it up for a few more seconds before we move on. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this slide kind of addresses some of the considerations for planning in addressing this topic in the planning process for NYMTC and for the member agencies and others. There are a lot of factors involved, a lot of considerations, and we've touched on some of those. So we have equity, we have the cost of the technology, fuel distribution systems, emissions in the vehicle systems themselves, energy storage, power, propulsion systems, a whole list, some of which are named on this slide. We've also heard a couple of things during this presentation about battery safety and some concerns about that and having to get rid of an electric bicycle because of that. That's been in the news a lot. Driving range comes up quite a bit. The ability to accommodate increased demand on the grid as we get more and more electric vehicles. We have vehicle weights with equipment on board that's heavier than a standard car. And then sort of behind the scenes, there are operation maintenance issues with training technicians for working on the vehicles and working on the equipment that fuel the vehicles. Recovery and first responders are some other issues. And then we also heard loss of gasoline and diesel tax revenue, or we heard that tax revenue as a potential incentive for moving to an electric vehicle. So we have a whole host of factors and planning considerations when trying to anticipate what the future holds with these programs and these alternative fuels and vehicles, and all the factors here on the outside that they're associated with them. And you see the big question mark over this person's head, and I think that's where a lot of us are at. So as we think about the future and what this means for NYMTC's RTP and some of the activities and strategies that come out of it, those are good considerations. And they all involve trade-offs, between the investment in these new technologies versus those to serve existing modes of transportation or vehicle technology. And those trade-offs involve things that we don't know, that some of it's unknown. So these are all considerations that NYMTC has to make as they go through this process. And if you go to the next slide, please. It's also a changing world, as someone alluded to in one of the comments. There are a lot of technological developments impacting alternative fuel vehicles. These kind of revolve around how do we power the vehicle through advanced charging and fueling technology. What kind of vehicles are available for us to utilize for advanced vehicle technologies and retrofits or hybrid type vehicles. And then the available infrastructure. How do we fuel these vehicles? How do we get the fuel to where it needs to be? How do we build out these charging networks and these corridors that we're looking at and planning for to provide the infrastructure needed to fuel all of these vehicles? So this is a fast, rapidly changing area. We've listed here just a handful of some of the considerations and approaches under each of these three broad areas. So with that in mind, we'll go to the next slide with a polling question. And we're looking for your thoughts on what you see as the biggest barrier to further adoption of alternative energy sources in your community, given what I just mentioned and some of the options we listed here. So you can select all that apply as barriers, like looking for your input on these.
And again, I'm sorry. And again, if there's anything we haven't mentioned here in the other category, just pop it in the chat. We're getting great chat feedback as well. So just let us know your thoughts.
I see a comment on the chat about range anxiety. That's certainly a big issue. So the two responses that have received the most responses so far are the higher costs related to the new infrastructure and these different vehicles and their operation, and the lack of available infrastructure for fueling and charging them. We also have a greater inconvenience related to these. That's certainly true. There's a learning curve. There's a learning curve about how to do it and where we can find stations and infrastructure to refuel and charge. There's lack of support from local, state, or national policymakers. We certainly see that. And there was a comment before about some of the information that's overly politicized. We have an interesting comment here, limited community support or demand. And then we have insufficient alternative supply in electric grid infrastructure. So and that goes back to the range anxiety issue and how far do we have to travel between refueling or recharging. So thank you for those answers. I think we can move on. I think we have one more polling question. And this is the open-ended question I referred to. And it is, are there any other considerations we should be aware of when planning for alternative energy in the transportation sector? We've covered a whole host already, but in this forum, we're looking for your additional thoughts and other considerations we should be aware of. And or appreciate your input here on this open-ended question. We have a response that says prioritize e-bikes as they are much cheaper to purchase and operate. Okay, thank you. Are there other priorities that people like to express, other considerations? How weather affects EV range? Yep, that's certainly an issue. Making alternative energy more accessible for small transit agencies. These are great. This is great feedback. Just leave it open for a few more seconds. Matching the gas station experience for charging and refueling. Yes. And NIMBYism with a couple of question marks. I'm interested in whoever responded with that, if you have any elaboration.
Yes, please, for the NIMBY comment, we'd love to know more about what you mean. Just examples or just your thoughts. It's a really interesting response.
All right, I think the activity here is has died down. So we can go on to the next slide, Stephanie.
Okay. So if you have additional feedback you'd like to give, you can always submit a comment to our plan website. It's movingforward2055.org. I put that in the chat, but you can always just type it into your browser as well if you're having trouble accessing it from WebEx. And that has a host of other outreach opportunities and additional topical forums that we are hosting through June. So we'd love to hear more comments from you and spread the word that we are having these forums, as we really got some great feedback today, and we'd love to hear more from people. And then for those who are interested in logging their credits via APA, I put that link in the chat as well. If you'd like, yeah, you can use this link, or you can just, if you go to APA and just type in, just search NYMTC, this event shows up, and you just log your comments. There's a place to log your hours and log the presentation right on that page. So that is available for you as well. Any final comments from the team?
There's
Just a
Oh, we
very
got the
comment,
DOT
yep.
some comment.
Yes.
Hang on 1 second. It was a thank you so much. That's sort of coming from the DOT. With the challenges of and perceptions of danger of fires, there are challenges with receiving community acceptance of new infrastructure that may pose a perceived danger for the neighborhoods. This applies more for hydrogen or other fuels. We even have significant reviews required by FDNY. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is great. Thanks, thanks, thanks.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, Rich, Jerry, Anna, the team. It was a really great forum today. I think we've got a lot of information that's going to be useful for developing the plan. I'll just mention that we've got a couple more forums coming up. On June 11th, we've got one for curb and parking management, and June 25th will be transportation and technology. We hope to see you at both. Thanks again, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.